Hi, students. Welcome to the lesson on Noah and the flood. I apologize that I can't be there today, but my daughter was in the hospital all weekend and I have to continue to help her recover from a severe asthma attack. The learning objectives for this lesson will be to summarize the flood narrative, which hopefully you've already done after reading it over the weekend, explain the theological truths of the flood narrative. We'll in the next class, design, write, and illustrate a comic that summarizes the flood narrative and communicates the theological truths using words, symbol, and mood. We'll also define covenant and explain the terms of the Noah covenant in the literal and allegorical senses. So we always begin with the literal sense. So the literal sense first starts with what does the story actually say? So hopefully you read the narrative over the weekend and are familiar with the kind of beginning, middle, and end of the flood story. Also the literary context and historical context. So for the literary context, the flood story, you may have noticed, has a lot of repetition. And the reason for that is it's a combination of two different sources. As I put here, it's kind of the first cut and paste job. So you have the J source, which is the Yahwist, and it's the source that was for Genesis 2 and 3. And then you also have the priestly source. And these are two sources that were combined together to create, they each had their own version of the story, so the story was obviously very important, and the editors of the Bible combined the two stories to make one whole story. The literary form is a narrative, so it's a narrative is a story, a beginning, middle, and end. And as I said, it's been cut and paste from these two sources. It also has many ancient parallels. Just like we saw in Genesis 1, it was in conversation with the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. The flood story is in conversation with the Sumerian flood myth of the epic of, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that was the Babylonian flood epic. And then the Sumerian one was the Atrahasis. So these two stories are very similar, and they also are similar to the flood epic in the Bible. So you'll see the basic outline of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis are the same. But what the differences are where you get into the theology, just like we saw with the Enuma Elish. I put the links to the ancient Near Eastern stories here. They're also on Schoology if you want to read them. Another important literary word that we can apply to this is the idea of an archetype. So, as it says here, an archetype is a constantly recurring symbol or motif in literature, painting, or mythology. In various seemingly unrelated cases in classic storytelling, media, etc., characters or ideas sharing a similar traits reoccur. So, you've probably encountered this word in your literature classes, but archetypes are kind of cross-cultural themes that reoccur in different time periods. And the idea of a flood epic is a cross-cultural archetype that occurs in all cultures all over the world. And so, as you could see, we're dealing with ancient Near Eastern flood epics, so the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, and the story from the Bible. But this is considered an archetype. And so that's another literary term you can add to your analysis of the flood story. So, the significance theologically of the Noah epic is especially when we compare it to the Gilgamesh story that you reviewed in your Google form. Remember in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods destroyed humanity because they were too loud. And so, another thing that didn't come out in the video, because it was just a brief analysis, when the gods destroy the earth in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis, they only regret it because they begin to starve to death. And so, when they realize that the human beings have been saved by Ea, the god of wisdom, at first, the big daddy god Enlil was going to kill the Atrahasis or Utnapishtim off, but Ea says, "Wait, don't do that. Don't be hasty." And so the gods, much like in the Enuma Elish, are very petty and very cruel. They don't actually really have a very good reason to destroy humanity. Compare this with God in the Bible. In the Bible, it says that God regretted um, creating humanity, and that's why I have this term anthropomorphism here. Anthropomorphism is when we give human-like qualities to non-human things. For example, I call my dog my little baby, and I say that my daughters are her sisters. Well, that's humanizing the dog. I mean, they're not really her sisters. We see this in the Bible. The author of the Bible says that God regrets creating humanity in his heart, but and I might have that on the next slide too. But this is kind of giving a human-like quality to God. God doesn't actually have emotions, and also in ancient Hebrew idea, the heart isn't where emotions lie anyway. They're rather the heart is the seat of the intellect. We usually think of our intellect in our brains or our minds. So the point of saying that God regretted creating humanity in his heart was to say that God didn't destroy humanity for a silly or arbitrary reason like the gods of the ancient Near East did. God looked at what humanity had become, and it said that they had become completely evil. And so, in order to cleanse the earth, he saves the one good human being, and that's where we have here God's mercy and second chances, so that humanity can continue. So when we read the story of Noah and the flood, sometimes it sounds very harsh and like it's a story of judgment, but it's really a story of mercy and second chances. God doesn't want the human race to be completely bad. And so he sees that Noah is good and he wants to purify the earth and start over again. So he saves humanity, almost like saving humanity from itself. And he cleanses the earth and starts over again. So, in terms of the anthropology is how we understand human nature in the story. First of all, we saw the cycle of sin began with Adam and Eve, and because of Adam and Eve's original sin, we all inherited um, the condition of original sin, which made us prone to sin. We saw that began to snowball with Cain and Abel, and now it's gone completely out of control, so much so that the whole earth is corrupt. And so, as it says here in Genesis 5, the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. So what that means is all of human nature was so corrupt that God needed to kind of hit the reboot button and start over. But it says that Noah alone was righteous before God. And so rather than just destroy everything and start over, God saves Noah and begins again through him. In terms of how do we understand creation or a sense of eco-spirituality, when God destroyed the earth, he couldn't just destroy he didn't just destroy the humans, he destroyed all the living creatures. And the reason why this is significant is it shows the connectedness between humankind and all of creation. Because we were given dominion over all of creation in Genesis, when we mess up, it messes up the entire earth. And so when God hits the reboot button, he recreates all of nature, not just humans, but everything. And so this should give us pause. And we're kind of seeing this kind of history be repeating right now. Because think about what we're doing to the earth through the sins of consumerism, the sins of pollution. We're actually destroying the entire earth once again. And so there's also a potent symbol of blood. When it talks in why was humankind so bad? It talked about our violence. And so blood is a potent symbol in the Old Testament. So the flood actually washes the blood of violence off the earth. This is going to become important in the New Testament because the flood is going to become a symbol of it's a type for baptism. In Peter, it talks about how the baptism was prefigured in the flood. And just like God flooded the earth, during Noah's time to cleanse the blood of violence. We are bathed in the blood of Christ and the blood of baptism to be freed from sin. But again, the idea here is that humans are responsible for creation. And as humans go, so goes the earth. And so we should be wary of that, make sure to take care of creation and not abuse it. So another important theme that you saw from the video in the Google form from the Bible Project is the idea of covenant. And they emphasize the idea of covenant as a partnership. So covenants are conditional. That means both sides have obligations. So God promises something and we also have an obligation to God in return. The one exception to this would be the Noah covenant, because God establishes the covenant and he does it because of Noah's faithfulness, and his sacrifice is a symbol of his faithfulness after the flood. But Noah technically doesn't have to do anything. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in the next slide. And one of the key themes of covenant is that even though again and again and again we'll fail, God always keeps his promises. That's one of the things that makes covenant so special. And covenant is key to both the Old and the New Testaments. In fact, when the term testament means covenant. We have the old or the first covenant, and then we have the new or the second covenant. So covenants have all have different parts, and this was the way my teachers in school broke it up into 4 parts. We have the parties of the covenant. That refers to who is in the covenant. One party is always God, and the other parties will change over time. Next are the terms. The terms of the covenant are what are the obligations of the covenant? What does God promise, and what do humans promise in return? Remember, it's a partnership. It's conditional. So God promises things and we promise things to God in return. Then we have the image of God in the covenant. That means, how does the covenant teach us about God? What is the theology of the covenant that shows us different truths about God? And then finally, all the covenants have different signs and symbols that remind us of the covenant. So let's take a look at the 4 parts of the covenant with Noah. In this one, the parties are God and then Noah. But in this covenant, Noah represents all of creation. So he represents all of humanity, and also not just humanity, but creation itself. So this is a universal covenant. This will be important when we come back to Jesus in the New Testament. The terms of the covenant, this covenant is also unique because it's unconditional. God initiates the covenant with Noah and doesn't make him do anything in return. However, in setting up the new creation with Noah, he does give him guidelines. These are not conditional to the covenant, but I wanted to point them out because these will come up again when you study the formation of the church next year with Mr. Iden and Mr. Will. First of all, there's the idea that Noah will worship God. That's symbolic of the fact that God is first impressed and wants to make a covenant with Noah because he offers sacrifice. God also renews the idea that Noah should be fruitful and fill the earth, as in his first kind of proto covenant with with Abraham. He also tells them that they can eat animals, but not to eat animals with their lifeblood in it, which basically means to cook your food. So prior to that, in the primeval history, everybody was a vegetarian, but because of the violence that had kind of been in humans' hearts, God realizes at this point that asking them to be vegetarian might be fruitless. So he says, you may eat meat, just make sure you cook it, which is basically setting up the basics of civilization. Like, what does it mean to be a civilized human being? We don't eat animals raw like a caveman. We cook our food. And then finally, there's outlawing of murder. Blood is a potent symbol here. Again, he says anybody who takes a human's life and spills his blood on account will be accountable for the blood that he spills. And again, these are not conditional to the covenant. These are just basic rules that set up civilization. Worship God. You have to procreate, otherwise the human race will. There won't be any other humans. Be civilized, cook your food, and don't kill each other. The image of God in the covenant is actually this odd juxtaposition. We see that God is both just and merciful. He's just because he serves humankind consequence for their sin. But he's also merciful. He doesn't just kill everybody arbitrarily like the ancient Near Eastern gods do. Rather, he sees that Noah is good and faithful, so he saves Noah and begins the story of covenant and relationship with humankind again. So it's this balance of God both being just and merciful. We also see a lot of anthropomorphism, as I said earlier. Anthropomorphism is when we give God human like qualities. So we see a lot of that in this story with God having, being described as having emotions. It talks about how God shut the ark with his hand. And so that's kind of, we see very human like images of God, much like we saw in Genesis 2 and 3. Finally, the sign of the covenant is the rainbow. God says to remind himself that he will never flood the earth again on account of humanity's sin. He puts his bow in the sky. And now we see the rainbow every time it rains. And this type of thinking where it's a story to explain a natural phenomenon, that's called an etiology. So this story is has theological truths, but also what we would call an etological truth, meaning it does explain why do we see rainbows in the sky because of the covenant with Noah. So when I get back, we will. Oh, I took those slides out. Well, that's enough for today. We'll go over the assignment we're going to do with Noah, which will be make little comic strips to review the story when I get back, and I will see you soon. Again, I apologize for being absent.